Well, again, in this episode, like all of them, is made possible with support from primarily the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, but also the Foundation for Economic Justice, Common Ground USA, the Henry George Institute, Oath Sharing Associates, and personal donations from people like Gib Halverson, Sue Hansel, Mark Sullivan, who will be on, and Asamu Ohira. And Mark is here. He is a former president of the Council of Georgist Organizations. He is also a longtime administrative director of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, the secretary treasurer of the Henry George Institute, and I don't know your title with Earth Sharing Associates.
Co-coordinator.
Okay. And I'll jump off and let you take it from there.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Well, I'd like to introduce our speaker. He got involved with the works of Henry George many years ago, and took them to heart, and it changed his life. He became the chief assessor of British Columbia way back, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s. He caused them to upgrade, update, and reassess all the land in British Columbia. And they still use the system that he set up. Later on, he was the assessor of Greenwich, Connecticut, where he was land assessor of, property assessor of various properties. Greenwich is one of the wealthiest communities in the country. And one of his adventures was to assess the property of Mel Gibson, who was claiming to operate a farm in Greenwich as a to reduce his taxes. He can tell you about that if he likes. He's been for many years, up until a few weeks ago, with the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, board member, former executive director, and former president. He's with Common Ground USA as treasurer, president of the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, and one of the most active Georgists that I've known in my life, and privileged to call him my friend. He's going to talk about Progress and Poverty, and that was the book that made Henry George famous. And as president of RSF a few years ago, he launched the annotated works of Henry George, which is still in production. Volume 2 was Progress and Poverty, or is Progress and Poverty. And I understand from the editor of that project that volumes 4 and 5 are well in the works and may both be published nearly simultaneously later this year. And this is a book that has influenced everybody, including Albert Einstein. And I'd just like to read one passage and then turn it over to Ted Gwartney. In the preface to the centenary edition, 1979, George's granddaughter, the famous choreographer Agnes George DeMille, wrote this: "Our government, alas, was predicated for its effectiveness in expansion on free land. Now there is no more free land, and the flaw in the great plan grows evident. We have reached the boundaries, and we turn back on ourselves and devour." As George said, the truth that I've tried to make clear will not find easy acceptance. If that could be, it would have been accepted long ago. If that could be, it would never have been obscured. We are on the brink. It is possible to have another dark ages. But in George, there is a voice of hope. And now to hear more about this voice of hope, I introduce Ted Gwartney.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to be talking about Progress from Poverty in just a minute as a part of the wonderful display that was put on by Mary Rose Kaczorowski at the San Francisco Library. I'm going to just spend a minute with you and talk about that because we had a chance to go up and look at it, and I'm going to tell you just what a wonderful event it was. The title was Who Owns the Earth? Henry George's Progress in Poverty, 140 years later at the San Francisco Public Library, the San Francisco History Center. And this is a report that she made for Common Ground. The exhibit at the library was sponsored by the San Francisco History Center in partnership with the California chapter of Common Ground, Henry George Schools in Los Angeles and in New York City and San Francisco, Robert Schockenbach Foundation, and the organization Shaping San Francisco. The event was opened on October 12th of 2019, and it was extended through Sunday, January 5th. That should be 2020. So it went for a full 3 months. And just to describe it, the library in San Francisco is a wonderful large building. And on the 6th floor is where their history center is located. It's a large floor, and they have these beautiful display cabinets. And they originally gave Mary Rose 8 cabinets that she filled up with memory, all this material. She was able to gather material from all across the country, from the Henry George Schools and from other people that had these things. And as a result, the display was just spectacular. And she made up cards that identified all of the artifacts and had hanging displays and so forth. It got to be so large that the library then increased the number of tables by 50%, went from 8 tables to 12 tables. And she filled them all up. And we went up, I know I took my wife along with me, and we just had a wonderful time inspecting the material that she had done. There were 3 events that were also sponsored as part of the event in San Francisco. The first one was the opening ceremony on October 12th. And at that, Mary Rose and the head of the library section gave speeches, and Fred Falvey actually presented the library with an annotated copy of Progress in Poverty. Then on November 7th, in the main library, there was a session, Meet Henry George. And this was historian and actor David Geeson, who gave a presentation acting as Henry George and what life was like in San Francisco as he was writing Progress in Poverty. Then on November 13th, the Area Cruzada Center for Culture and Politics, there was a free public talk on Progress to Poverty, Land and Rents. That was a group of 3 of us, and it was co-sponsored by Shaping San Francisco. And it was kind of a wonderful opportunity, and that was where I gave the talk that I'm going to be presenting this evening. What was interesting about the group, and it was standing room only, there were 55 people in attendance, and we just couldn't squeeze any more people in. And at the end, there was a wonderful question and answer session. The group was decidedly left-wing. Some of them were Marxist in orientation, but it made for a really good talk, and getting the information out to this group was really a lot of fun and very, very interesting. So here's the talk that I gave to the group. You're going to hear the same talk. I'm using these PowerPoint presentation slides to help me through it. So the title, Progress in Poverty, Land and Rents. As you all know, Henry George wrote Progress in Poverty, and he finished it in 1879 in San Francisco. Just as background, Henry George was a humanitarian, an intellectual seeking equity and social justice for all people. George lived in a time that experienced social problems, inequities that are similar to those that we have today. In his life, he was faced with the same kinds of questions. Why is my rent so high? Why are my wages so little? Why are there no jobs? Why do I have no savings? These are the same kind of questions that we're still getting in today's world. And they were the same questions that existed at the time that Henry George wrote Progress in Poverty. Many people in San Francisco had no housing, and some slept on the streets. That sounds familiar. Bringing you up to date, a median one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco today, on the median, the middle, costs $3,700 a month. This kind of chart kind of shows you about how rents have been increasing over time. In the United States, over a 3-year period, they went up almost 6%. Whereas in California, very dynamic and with social change going on, 11.5%. But in San Francisco, rents over the 3-year period went up 13%. So getting back to Henry George and his life. George was born in Philadelphia. When he was 16 years of age, he shipped out as a deckhand on a vessel bound for Melbourne and Calcutta. When he returned back home, he trained as a typesetter, and after 9 months of serving apprenticeship, he left for San Francisco. The gold rush was on. In 1858, George joined his cousin in British Columbia, supplying gold miners on the Fraser River. After deciding against gold mining, he headed back to San Francisco to work as a printer, a typesetter, and as a journalist. George was married in 1861 at the age of 22. He was out of work and he was without income. He had to beg for food on the streets of San Francisco to keep his family from starving. In the 1864 Depression, led him to question the social inequality and the state of the economy and the state of society around him. Why was there such disparity between wages and rent? And I think that chart is kind of interesting that I found, because it talks very much about the way that people think, today even. We're in a recession. People want to buy. Did she get fired? Layoff. Depression. We're on a depression. It's time to sell. George asked and thought about, why do innovations increase rent? And why do innovations reduce job opportunities? It made no sense to him. I mean, you would think that innovations that make work easier to do things, that there would be benefit, would it be increases in wealth and increases in wages. But instead, rents were increasing and job opportunities were decreasing. He asked the question, who has the right to exploit the Earth's resources, or who owns the Earth? George was an intellectual, and he read and thought insatiably on these topics. This next slide is one of the slides that really caught my attention when I was very young, because it was so nonsensical. This is a map of California. This is the land that was given to the railroads for building the railroads out and into California. They were given the most valuable land in the state of California. And you can see it almost makes up 50% of all the land in California. Why were the railroads given title to all of this land? And this was one of the big things that got George really thinking about the whole questions. It certainly attracted my attention. At age 39, while living in this rented house at the foot of San Francisco Bay, George wrote Progress and Poverty. At first, he self-published it in 1879 with the help of fellow typesetters in San Francisco. And his book, Progress and Poverty, was hailed for its logic and genius at solving social inequality. George, at the time, was one of the founders of the San Francisco Public Library and also the Bohemian Club. And he's known yet today in the library for being one of the founders, one of the most active people in setting up the San Francisco Public Library. George worked as a writer and editor for the Daily Times and was later the editor of the San Francisco Daily Evening Post. Henry George was a great San Franciscan. He was a contemporary of Mark Twain in seeking equity for all. George sparked the progressive era. This is something I think that we talk about all that Henry George did, but he was right there active at the time of the progressive era, where it saw child labor laws and women's rights, Interstate Commerce Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act. During that era, there was a generate economic reform and welfare of the public. George's theories. George found one underlying cause for two great economic problems. The first problem, chronic poverty, arising from insufficient demand for labor. The second, the cycles of boom and bust. So dealing with the first, chronic poverty. Land ownership was so concentrated, a few large landowners and speculators held the best land idle or underused, forcing labor onto marginal land, driving down wages. George's remedy, following this analysis with a plausible, practical remedy, which was eliminating all taxes except for a tax on land value. The second problem, the cycles of boom and bust. Holding the best land idle or underutilized caused land prices to increase beyond their productive value, with a collapse of speculation and price bubbles causing periodic busts. And we've seen this now for the last 300 years, these booms and busts in the cycle. And this was Henry George really provided the answer. Our economists today don't understand it as he very well described it. By breaking up the large idle holdings, making land available to those who would use it properly, that would suck the air out of the speculative bubble, restraining the boom and bust cycles. I've added just a few comments here about land value taxation. First of all, land is a sustainable revenue base. It's something that will provide lasting revenue. Public services increase rents. Demand increase rents. Land rent continues. It always exists. It's visible. It's a growing source of funds, and it cannot move. So taxation of land is totally different than the taxation of wages and investment. It has different results. The economic results of land taxes: land would cost less. New businesses could start. New investments in production. New jobs would be created, and wages would increase. Taxing land is very progressive because land ownership is highly concentrated among the most wealthy, far more concentrated than income. So taxing land is fair because the community, rather than the individual landowners, create the land value. Taxing land is economically efficient because the owner cannot avoid a land tax by choosing less taxed options. Basically, land cannot move to avoid taxes. If you want the best location, you have to pay for it. Land and nature belongs to mankind. Its value increases with public improvements and the desire of man to use the best land that gives them the advantages of a superior location. So I gave this talk in San Francisco, and this is just a beautiful picture of downtown San Francisco. We're over kind of in the Bay Area, looking downtown. George's ideas are still relevant today. The San Francisco Bay Area contends with the highest land values and rents in the entire nation, and also with unprecedented homelessness. Those who benefit by increasing land prices know how to prevent their land monopoly from paying its fair share. The other point that I make is how over the last 100 years, wages as a part of gross domestic product have actually gone down by a lot. This is based upon the Australian study that was done. They found, looking at the period from 1911 to 2007, less than 100 years, wages dropped from 85% of gross domestic product down to 48%, from 85 in 2011 down to 48% in 2007. At the same time, land rents increased from 9% in 2011 to 28% in 2007. This is the chart from Australia, which I think really shows it crystal clear. The numbers I just gave you. The blue at the most color on the chart is what goes as the payment from the gross domestic product as wages and investment return. The sharp red line is how much is collected in land rent. And the lower red group, the other lower group, is what's collected in other kinds of taxes other than land rent. And then the gray at the very top is what is left for the landowners to take. This is where we saw the land rent growing from 8% to 26% in that same period, as we saw wages going down in that same period. So the chart, I think, really makes the point stand out about how traumatic this is to watch this 100-year period and what happened. Australia, just in comment, has some of the best records that are available on land rent studies. And Terry Dwyer and Brian Kavanaugh conducted this particular study, where they found that more than 25% of gross annual domestic product is represented by land rent. Now, Australia's land rent is adequate. If they collected all the land rent in Australia, there would be no reason for them to have any taxes on buildings, wages, productive businesses, commerce. They could fund all government services. We found the same to be true in the United States, certainly in California. Wherever I've looked at it, this is one borne out. When you look at the statistics, land rent is adequate to provide government services and to do away with other kinds of taxes. A quote from Henry George. Therefore, he who holds the land on which and from which another man must live is that man's master, and the man is his slave. Very, very strong remark from Henry George. I also like to show this slide just as I'm closing, because I think it kind of brings home what's happening in reality in our world. This is a quote from Joe Stiglitz, and I call it the 1%'s benefit, which is rent. Much of the inequality in our economy has been the result of rent seeking, because to a significant degree, rent seeking redistributes money from those at the bottom to those at the top. So in closing, we should be using land rent for public purposes rather than for private gain. I think at this time we'll open it up to questions, and I'm going to ask Mark and the others also to help me in answering the questions and asking the questions.
Okay, well, please send in your questions. There's one comment that's not a question. It's from Scott Baker, 1911. So it must be in reference to some fact that was presented. And there was one spelling correction, which I'll tell Ted about afterwards. Any real questions? I found it very interesting. I thought almost the closing chart from Brian Kavanaugh in Australia was quite telling. And there's nothing more powerful than an image, which really is worth 1,000 words. And it reminds me of sort of the rent charts that many people who study Henry George have encountered. And that shows the increase of rent at the expense, particularly of wages. And one thing that occurred to me in talking about the homelessness situation in San Francisco, which certainly exists in most cities in the United States, including in New York, where I am, is the homelessness that will increase now as a result of the evictions, which are a result of people losing their jobs due to the coronavirus shutdown. And so far, I've not heard of any initiative that's passed, at least the federal government, to deal with the expected increase in homelessness. A lot of rent was due 6 days ago, and we know evictions are now beginning. And again, it will be the people at the bottom who are going to suffer the most. I'm wondering whether there's any news from California about how either San Francisco or Los Angeles or any other city or the state itself is dealing with this.
Let me just say that let's go back to the economic crisis that occurred in 2008 and 9. And in California, and I think in most of the United States at that time, we saw a lot of homelessness and people losing the homes that they had lived in. In fact, in California became so severe that there was a large re-ownership of homes from individual homeowners into corporate owners. And we saw corporations buying up foreclosed properties that they then rented out. And many of these houses are still owned and still rented out. This is the kind of thing that I think we may see as a result of this coronavirus that's happening, that when people really cannot afford the rent anymore or don't have the means to live, the property will be bought out again by speculators who will then hold on to it. Some of them sell it at enormous profit. Some of those sales are going on in California right now that were taken over in 2009 and 10 and 11, and they're now being sold, or they were being sold at enormous profits. And I think that we will be seeing in California some serious results as a result of all that we're going through with shutting down businesses. But right here where we live in Southern California, the restaurants all opened up 2 weeks ago just to be shut down again after being in business for 2 weeks. And we have a neighbor who's got a wonderful Mexican restaurant. And, you know, he just really does not know what to do because he cannot really afford to keep his staff running and operating with not knowing if he's going to allow to go in business. We now have several cities in the areas I live in, they're actually closing down streets and allowing restaurants to build outdoor dining, putting tables out and serving the food because they don't want the people congregating inside. We're finding out more now from this virus that it does not make sense to have restaurants inside or bars inside where you have large groups of people spreading the disease. So I think that we're going to see more of a trend towards outdoor dining. And we're already seeing it where I live. That's virtually all the restaurants now are going to either pick up or to outdoor dining.
It's almost as if we're having a giant going out of business sale, but only a few amongst us have the resources to take advantage of it. Well, another question comes in from Ed Dotson, and he says, recently when I write to talk about our circumstances, I say that most of us are, in effect, sharecroppers, even if we do not work the land. Does that sound right to you, Ted?
Give me the phrase he used again.
Sharecroppers.
Sure.
Whether or not we work the land, we're in effect sharecroppers.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of phrasing it. We are sharecroppers in essence, and we're seeing that the land rents really are going to those that are able to control and monopolize the land. And those who have the small equity, either their home or their business, basically are sharecroppers. Dan and Sue, if either of you have questions, be sure you can raise them too.
There's a couple here that I'm going to combine them in a way. They might be related. Izzy Gleaner from Canada says, why do we think modern economists don't support this line of thinking? And Ellen Ridley from San Diego says, how do we begin to interest young people and the general public in this same line of thinking? So why do modern economists, why aren't they sort of buying into this? And how can we get the public, particularly young people, in a sense, to buy into it, to see the cat, as we like to say?
But as the first question, I think that modern economists are tending to see boom and busts and ascribe all kinds of reasons to them, ignoring the fact that land is the primary reason for a boom and bust. They identify other things that are causing it, and they kind of wear blinders. And in terms of raising revenue, again, they're wearing blinders. It is so easy to collect land rent, and it's such a burden on people to have to pay sales taxes, for example. They're talking about raising the sales tax in Fullerton, just a few blocks away from where I live, from 8% to 9%. They're going to be on the ballot, which basically means that every time you buy something or buy a meal or anything in Fullerton, you're going to be paying more. And they don't seem to understand the fact that by imposing taxes upon production and distribution, you damage production and distribution. Whereas if you tax land, you actually benefit the use of land. You allow land to be used more productively. Now, I don't know why economists miss this. It's beyond me. I mean, I understood this when I was in college, and I understand it today, and it really hasn't changed. In terms of getting young people interested, well, I was very fortunate because I learned about Henry George when I was in college and I was young. And that was to my advantage because, one, I was able to set a career in the field, and two, people recognized me as being a young Georgist, you know, and I got invited to give talks and so forth. And when I was young in the Georgist movement, I actually was invited to go to Europe on 2 occasions, and I gave talks at the Henry George School meetings and so forth. And so it was great. I mean, I really had an advantage being young. And somehow we have to give those same advantages to the young people we find today. I know I encourage youngsters to even consider, you know, a career in the assessment world. Because one, it is a good career, one that you can last and have a good retirement and so forth with. But it also then gives you the chance to do the job properly and see that things are done properly and gradually shift our revenue from production and distribution onto land values.
I'd like to follow up with that, but there are some other questions coming in. So I'll defer on the whole question of the importance of accurate assessments. But there, Wynn Ackenbaum from Delaware has some questions about the exhibit. Were there photographs, the exhibit? She did see the film with David Geeson performing as Henry George and appreciated it. So Ted, can you say a little bit more about the exhibit?
I know that I took a lot of photographs, and my intention was to get them downloaded so I could show them tonight as I was talking about it. However, I was unable to get them onto my computer and operational in time. So I'll promise to show them when I do another report for the Common Ground meeting. I'll have pictures at that meeting. That's coming up in 2 weeks from today. And part of that is to report about what the chapters did. And the California Common Ground chapter sponsored the New York exhibit. And I promise I'll have the pictures. If you attend two weeks from now session, you'll have good pictures. It was fantastic. And you simply walked into this area and it was like filled with Henry George. All the pictures, all the books, all the hanging displays, and other people that were well known by Henry George and that commented on Henry George in his life were all there in pictorial displays and so forth. So I'm sorry I couldn't get those pictures up tonight, but I promise in 2 weeks from now, I'll get them up and show them to you.
Well, that's great. And Mary Rose Kaczorowski, who organized the exhibit, sends in a question or a comment from where she is in Fort Bragg, California, with a spike in coronavirus cases statewide, forcing authorities to reinstate restrictions. California Governor Gavin Newsom gave local governments the authority to halt renter evictions through September. So that's a response to my question earlier. And then Ed Dodson comments on homelessness. Even before the pandemic, tent cities have been and are existing in over 100 cities around the United States, and the size of each is growing year by year. So that indicates quite a problem. One that we actually have the solution to. And so the question of getting other people to hear what we're saying is really vitally important to the people who are really suffering the most from really the failure of our economy. And Scott Baker writes, why does the market fail to respond by lowering rents when so many people are being evicted? Ted, do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess it really comes back to, we have the right answer. It's getting people to realize what the problem is and that there is an answer to the problem. I think that most people kind of go on living just thinking that it's right that poverty exists, or that it's only right that people's wages go down over time instead of going up over time, or that innovation should make people poorer. I mean, what kind of a crazy person would think that? If you're able to do more productive work by having innovations, you should have greater wages. You should be able to do more, and you should be earning more. And all of us, I think, have kind of accepted this fatalism, that the world only gets worse, but we don't understand why. Well, we know why, and we know how it can be solved. And it's up to us really to get out and let people know. The problem is that not everyone is listening. It's hard to get audiences, but somehow we just need to kind of almost pound them over the head and say, here's what the problem is, and here's the solution.
Yeah, a really extensive, very nice comment from Martin Adams, who is himself the author of a book called Land, which I've always thought was an excellent and very much up-to-date introduction and intensive introduction to our ideas. So he says, thank you, Ted, glad to see you here. He says he's living now in Vancouver, British Columbia. I know he was living in California. And he says, thanks to you, Ted, and your work, land values here are valued accurately. As a matter of fact, my fiance works in the city of Surrey, British Columbia, as a planner and regularly assesses land values as part of your work. So thank you. The question I have is this. Georgists have tried education as a remedy for decades. Given that we're still seeing the old, quote, capitalism versus socialism, unquote, debate, are we simply failing to properly educate people, or is there some other approach we haven't considered? Oh, well, so toss that tough one to you, Ted.
Well, I really have to admit that even today we're going to be having a presidential election, and people are kind of in camps, those on the right and those on the left. And they're thinking about, well, that sounds socialistic, or that sounds, too monopolistic, or whatever. And we kind of buy into these things. I guess that what I think we have to do is we have to let people know that, like in British Columbia, we set up this wonderful system of valuing land every year. But as time's going on, we take less and less of that land value. It was set up so that we could collect 3 or 4% of land values, but in British Columbia, we're collecting less than 1%. And that's true almost universally. And in British Columbia today, if they would simply collect like even half the rent, there would be no reason to have taxes in British Columbia. Why have taxes if you can operate a government on rent? This is what we need to get out, this message, that governments can operate without having any taxes. I did the presentation in California, and I showed very clearly how in California we could eliminate all sales taxes, all income taxes, all property taxes on buildings, and simply collect land rent at 3/4 of the land rent that existed in California. And we'd be able to still then give people a surplus. There'd be more than enough to pay to get rid of all the taxes. But why don't we start selling the idea that there's enough land rent to not only do away with taxes, all taxes, but to also give people a surplus? I mean, maybe that's a way of selling the point. Because, we have the numbers now. I know for a fact that almost universally, because I've done this same work in Great Britain and other countries, that there is enough land rent to not only do away with all taxes, but to give people a surplus, a basic income would be. So that's one idea that I think that, Just Smith was hot on that idea at one point, and I think others have brought up that as reconsidering it.
There's another question comes in, and I'll just read it because I think it will make Ted feel good about his presentation, and I hope Sue Walton can follow up with this person who says, "This is my first time on this webinar. I live in San Diego and would like to connect with others that live out here. Will there be a list of names who are participating today, emails, where we live, state, city, for us?" And I know Ellen Ridley's in San Diego. I hope Sue can
I'd like to speak
and this
with
person in touch with each other.
Okay, to the person who wrote the note, if you'll send me a note in chat with your name and address, we will eventually do a list of attendees, but if I have your email address, I can put you in contact with Alan, and I can make sure you get further information about the upcoming seminars that we will be having. In fact, if you look over in chat, you'll see what's coming up on Sunday. So if you would email me in chat with your email and your name, I'll be happy to put you on our mailing list.
This is Dan Sullivan. I just wanted to say, participants, only attendees can use Q&A. So I wanted to note something and ask something. The thing I wanted to note, because it was a kind of a negative question about why don't modern economists pay attention to this? And 10 Nobel Prize winning economists have endorsed it, and Joe Stiglitz writes about it often. So I think that the modern economists do like it, but when they say so, it just goes into the ether. It doesn't go into anybody's echo chamber. And so the right-wing economists and left-wing economists have their echo chambers and a huge audience. And our economists, who are quite often very prominent, don't have that. So that was the comment. The question I had was, who in San Francisco has taken an interest in this? Is there anything coming out of the library talk, or what's the follow-up with that? And that might be Mary Rose might have to type an answer or something.
To the fellow in San Diego, first of all, Alan Ridley is the president of Foundation for Economic Justice. And I visit their meetings also. They have pretty much monthly meetings, and I think you would be invited to attend one of their meetings and meet some of us in person. And we also have a banquet each year. And in terms of the San Francisco event, you know, I think it takes time. I think that one, it's opened a lot of people's eyes and minds up to new ideas and new thinking. And sometimes it takes a bunch of these little sparks before a fire starts. And if we hit them enough times and you know, we reinforce what we've told them, it's a chance then to see them bloom. And I think we have to wait over time to do that. I've certainly seen people in my lifetime that really pick up on this and really run with it. Some of them die off. I think of some that that run with it for a while and then they kind of sit back. But those of us who really are true believers, you know, we're going to take it right to our grave.
Yeah, Ed Dodson sent something else in based on his experience that what he thought was needed, or maybe still does, is an economic think tank that produces regular forecasts of where the economy is going and is able to attract clients willing to pay for this information. And he mentions that one person who's doing this is Australian colleague Philip Anderson. And I would say also, you know, Fred Fulvari in California, Fred Harrison in London, England, there may be others, accurately predicted, I think it was the crash of 2008. And maybe rather than, the question may not be why do economists not notice, but why do the policymakers not take more notice? And I think politics may have more to do with that than the actual content of our ideas. I'll just throw that as a possibility.
We have had some think tanks in the past, and they've been very good. Perry Prentice from Time and House Home Magazine had seminars with leading politicians in the 70s, in which we really exposed the leaders who were, you know, state senators and state representatives, that got them excited and interested in our ideas. And I think we need to keep doing that. We've had other kinds of things, and I think we need to kind of encourage the people. Fred Harrison is just one that when he writes things, they're just beautiful. And he really gets to the point. And I think that we need to kind of praise those people who do well and utilize the work that they produce.
Historically, between the time George wrote Harvest and Poverty and the present day, about halfway in that timeline, at least in this country, mortgage interest became tax deductible. And my own thought is that, well, this gave the average homeowning voter reason to never vote for any kind of shifting of taxes off of labor investment and onto land value, because they felt, and sometimes they were wrongly told, that this would hurt them. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a very fair assessment, and even today it's kind of difficult in making our point, you know, because so many of us homeowners took advantage of that mortgage interest write-off and property tax write-off that we could get. And so it kind of closes people's mind because they're thinking in terms of, well, I don't want to hurt myself. And certainly on Proposition 13, it was sold as this protection of elderly people so that they wouldn't be booted out of their homes. Well, what they didn't say is that not only is it going to keep taxes low on homeowners, but more important, it's going to keep taxes low on land and corporations. And we saw in California where corporations used to pay 2/3 of the property taxes and homeowners 1/3, and it's reversed. Now homeowners pay almost all the property taxes, and the corporations pay very little, only 1/3 of the total. And so, like they sold Proposition 13 to benefit the old people, and it's not really benefiting them. It's really shifted all the taxes off of corporations' land ownership and onto individuals.
Yeah, Wayne Ackenbaum asks, is there awareness in California that Prop 13 has made housing less affordable? And might this be an opportunity to educate people?
I don't think that people, really get to the point about the housing would be less expensive. They don't get that far. I think at least right now we have this proposition coming up in November that would do away with Proposition 13 on businesses and industries. They'd have to pay full taxes instead of getting the cut to residential properties. So that would be, we're supporting that motion. Those of us who believe in it in California, that we want to see the taxes increase on land ownership that's corporately owned in California. But I think that homeowners have a hard time really realizing or accepting the fact that it will cause stability in prices, because they're kind of banking on the prices going up. They see their home going up in value. I look in my neighborhood where the house next door 10 years ago sold for $400,000. In 10 years, it's now $800,000. And so the people are kind of thinking like, well, I'm gonna be one who makes out like a bandit. So I don't want to pay property taxes. I'd rather just, I'm willing to pay the high income taxes and high sales taxes as long as I can keep the profit from my home. And that's kind of sad, but that's the way we think right now.
Yeah, so wouldn't that sort of bias the land market to even more speculation in residential land, because land put to commercial use or set aside for commercial use would pay a bigger tax bill?
I'm going to interrupt you because I have a question from Bob Jean. Is this technological and robotic revolution, do you think, or in this technological and robotic revolution, do you think Henry George would support a guaranteed annual income or Jeff Smith's citizens den?
Well, I think that the whole thing that Henry George would support is collecting all or most of land rent. And what happens to it, I think, is left up to the community. I would think that, first of all, you'd want to use the land rent to provide the fire services and the police services and the schools and everything else that you want in your community. But there's still going to be some surplus at the end. And I think that Henry George would buy the idea of, if there is a surplus, which there always is going to be, that it could be given back to the citizens as a basic income. I don't think that that's far outside of the way that Henry George thought.
No, if when the new edition of Protection of Free Trade comes out, you'll see that George explicitly supports something along that line. And he quotes another economist to the effect of no taxation and a pension for everyone.
Yep.
And that goes back, of course, to Tom Paine, who proposed something similar.
Yeah, I would like to have the problem of having so much revenue produced from land that we don't know what to do with it. I know that Harry Pollard said it would be better to throw it in the ocean than to not collect it. Well, I think we can collect it, and instead of throwing it in the ocean, have it as a dividend. to give to all people equally, so that all people would have like enough money to pay their bills and so forth, and would benefit from the common land value that a community creates.
Mary Rose sends in a comment again that in California, many of the properties are actually income properties. In other words, they may look like homes, but they're vacation rentals, Airbnbs, and second and third homes. And she mentions that there's a Jarvis group and realtors are against any change in Prop 13. And well, one thought, could that be just be most people don't like change of any kind, but I guess they really feel that this would hurt their particular interest group.
I don't know what the question was.
Well, I guess in other words, I guess if you're fortunate to own 2 or 3 homes,
yeah,
or if you're using your home as a vacation rental or Airbnb, and maybe the point of Mary Rose is making is then, can you then, your taxes would go up because it's a commercial operation on the Airbnbs rather than simply a residential property. Or would that be used as a way to make money? You're only paying taxes because it's your home, but you're doing Airbnb sort of on the side?
I fear that property owners are smart enough to figure out a way to avoid paying the higher taxes. Somehow they'll come up with gimmicks that will keep them in residential class, even though it's being operated commercially.
Yeah.
I think that that's the real thing. I think even on the changes to Proposition 13 that are being talked about, that the residential investment properties like apartments are not going to go up. You know, even though they're a business, they're not going to go up because they're residential. And I think that the whole thing is that the people who benefit know how to avoid the taxes. And I'm afraid that some of the corporations will come up with some similar ideas, but I think that in the long run, everyone will benefit if we get rid of Proposition 13, initially at least on business and eventually on everybody.
How are we on time? Do we want to take a few more questions that have come in?
That's fine. You have about, let's see, it's 8:04. You have about another 20 minutes.
Okay. Here's a question. I don't know who the person is. Comes from Science Cathedral. If you care to address this, with the manifest failure of policing, why do we take it as a given that we need to pay a centralized, inefficient corporation called the government for services that people could procure more efficiently through community cooperation using our wonderful Second Amendment, etc.? That's quote unquote.
That's kind of a political question, and I think that's one where we can kind of appreciate people's viewpoints. That it is possible, you know, to do things. Oftentimes, we can do things better than employing a government to do something, and that people do that. You know, people believe in communities, and they believe in social welfare, and they believe in charity. And I think that all of this is conducive with our beliefs that land rent belongs to all people. That's what we're saying, and that's what our major thrust is. And if we don't need to spend so much money on policing or on social services, it would only then increase the benefits that would be available for us in terms of a basic income. And so I'm saying, you know, yes, wherever we can do something better as individuals, or without government interference, we should do it. But at the same time, we should be sure that we have everything that we need publicly well taken care of.
Okay, a comment comes in from George Gentes. Many here in Nevada County, California, are convinced that modifying Prop 13 is only being used as a foot in the door to get rid of Prop 13. He says they don't realize that this modification, which simply broadens the base to include corporations, will at least be a step in taking the pressure off raising, quote, regressive, unquote, taxes like sales, etc. When you bring this up on local social media, they become rather hostile and shrill. Yet even this attempt at modification is only a small step and does not spotlight land value tax as it should. He says, no question, just a comment. Don't know if you care to comment on his comment, Ted.
Well, I'll just comment generally. I mean, I think that Proposition 13 was very poorly founded. It was sold to people thinking of poor ladies who might die if they had to pay higher taxes. And that is so unrealistic. You know, those days, that was 30 years ago, 40, that was 50 years ago, really. And I think that we now have, we shouldn't be living in this false thing about where we have to protect people with lower taxes. And we have to think of protecting all these people and so forth, supplying all things. I think if we simply operated our government efficiently and use the surplus revenue to give back to everybody, that we'd be better off. And we wouldn't have the problems that are identified right now with people who run into problems because of their low income or because of the community that they've been trapped in or whatever. And I think that what we're looking at is kind of creating a society that is more alive and benefited by the use of doing things productively and using resources productively. You know, from our basic courses, you know, that basically by using land productively, everyone benefits. And there's more wealth produced. And instead of it going to a few greedy landowners, it goes to everyone's benefit. I think those are the things we learned. And now I think we just have to get out and really sell people on these ideas.
An earlier question, which came in from Scott Baker, is the patent system a modern version of land monopoly? Now, when Progress and Poverty was first published, there was George's self-published edition and then the commercial edition. And as I understand it, one change he made was a footnote on patents and copyrights, and he distinguished between the two. But I'm presuming what Scott is saying, that given a big role in the economy for scientific innovation, is the patent system a modern version of land monopoly?
Well, we certainly see that drug companies in particular right now are the prime example, where they go beyond their patent period and they come up with minor little changes and change the name or change the formula a little bit. And they continue it on and on and on. And so they're abusing the patent system. They basically are fostering a monopoly system that continues to benefit them. As a result, we have the highest drug costs in the world. Other countries buy their drugs at a fraction of what we pay, and it's due to our monopolistic treatment of drugs. You know, basically that we allow these patents to just go on and on and on, and allow the companies to make tiny little changes. Now, I'm a diabetic, and I used to buy insulin $20 a bottle. Right now, that same bottle costs me $250. Now that's just criminal to have that kind of rapid change. And it didn't happen over 50 years. It really has happened more in the last 10 years. Because I mean, even 10 years ago, you could get insulin for $40 a bottle. Now it's $200.
I'm thinking this is even a more life and death question, perhaps with coronavirus, COVID-19, maybe to be followed by COVID-20 and COVID-21, and who knows, but research and response to a pandemic. I also wonder to what degree public funds are used by private corporations who then take a patent out on the research that was supported by public funds, whether to what degree they're actually also rent seeking on public spending.
The answer to all these questions is true. You know, there are people who really benefit from work that was done for public purposes. And there are people who benefit by taking advantage of the patent system and so forth. So I think that we really need to look at all of the problems that we're having and really come up with sound answers. We want to reward people for creative energies and so forth, but we don't want to give them a license to steal or to just keep raising the prices until people die, you know, in essence. So I think we have to find a balance there and deal with our patent system so that it's fair and it doesn't give advantages to some people.
Okay. Now the questions come in, and I think whoever asked the question really needs to explain what they mean. This person says they find it a gross distortion, Henry George's land value taxation idea to assess on an annual basis taxes on properties that are not being sold or rented. But this person doesn't explain why he or she thinks that. So I don't know whether you can even respond to it other than this person's taking issue with taxing land that is not either being sold or rented, meaning, I guess, idle land.
I'll answer that question. It's a simple question, really. And that is that we believe that land should be valued at what its market value is. And its market value is what the community would pay for the use of that land. And if a person wants to use the land exclusively, he has to pay the community a rental value for the annual use of that land. And there's no discounts to that. It's an ongoing thing that as property values change, they have to pay the change in value. Whether it's used or not is immaterial. They pay the same land value, revenue, tax, rent, whether it's used or not. I remember in Greenwich, we had a gas station who went out of business on one of the prime locations in town. They came in and said, well, lower our taxes. We don't have a gas station anymore. Well, that's laughable. They had the best location in town. They kept paying their taxes because they knew it was the best location in town. And you have to keep the pressure on people to get land used properly. If you allowed exemptions on unused property, people would just sit there and wait until they could sell it at some future price. People buy land on the hopes that they won't have to pay taxes so that when they sell it, they can make a fortune without having to spend money along the way. So as Georgists, we believe that all land should be taxed annually at its market value for its highest and best use, not for its vacant value being worth less. The only exceptions that maybe come up in people's mind, and I understand it, is farmers. But those really have answered themselves as time goes on, because farmers now pretty much are farming farmland. And there are still, most states have advantages to farmers, but the advantage is relatively small compared to the fact that they are getting so little revenue, net revenue from their land. If the farm happens to be right near a downtown area, they're going to pay full taxes on it. They can't just walk away without paying taxes.
I just wanted to add that the whole point of land value tax is to prevent people from creating shortages of land by holding it out of use. If everybody was putting their land to use, land value tax would be a much smaller issue.
There's another response to the comment on the increasing cost of prescription drugs, insulin, etc. From Yanni, who I believe is in New York. He says that today's dollar is not the same dollar as 10 years ago. It doesn't have the same purchasing power. Any comment on the role of money? Is this a serious omission? Or does Henry George's rent theory cover the role of the money issuance system?
Well, I think that money is important. It's a matter of exchange, and what we do on exchanging is we're exchanging our wealth for something that we want, and it's important that money be a stable source. I think that many Georges believed, in the gold standard, and believed in there being solid values behind money. Money now is fiat money, and it's created. And I think it's important that we all understand money, where it comes from, how it's used. And I think that many of us think that we should have state banks that are involved in doing mortgages and so forth, and doing commercial transactions. So I think the answer to the question is that, money is very important. That's something that we need to be considering. But I think the most important thing, and the thing we don't want to forget, is that we want to collect the revenue of land. And if we collect the revenue of land, these other issues will become clearer and easier to deal with.
Yeah, would you say that to the degree that land value tax would reduce the speculative increase in rent in the economy and the price of land, that lessens the pressure on the government to issue more money? Because it seems to me that that's driving the issuance of money to keep the game going, keep making sure that the rent keeps getting paid, so to speak.
Yeah, that's
But I jump in again. There's a paper on savings. If you go to savingcommunities.org/docs, DOCS for documents, and scroll down to Henry George, there's a paper called Henry George's Monetary Views that Stephen Zarlenga wrote, and it quotes Henry George extensively on money. And he basically was a greenbacker. He said banks should not be able to create money, that only government should be able to create money, because government, the bankers create lots of money during boom years, which fuels the speculative bubble. And then the credit constricts because the bankers see that there's a downturn coming, so they constrict the credit, which makes the crash worse. So Henry George saw the role between land and money, and he emphasized land, but he was not oblivious to the monetary question.
Another comment from Ed Dotson. Ted, you and I spent our careers in much of the same sector of our economy. I feel like I came into work every day, and he worked at Fannie Mae, putting my finger in the dike while trying to convince my banking colleagues of what is needed to be done. Did you have the same experience with your appraiser and assessor colleagues?
I did not have as serious of a situation as you're talking about, because my interest was in raising as much revenue from land as I could, but no one was suggesting that we collect all of the land rent. If we were doing that, I would really have to be sure that everyone was going along. But assessors that I've dealt with generally understand the importance of land values being assessed correctly. And most of them attempt to do that work. So I think that I didn't have as serious of a problem, because I think that the colleagues I was dealing with that worked for me or that I worked with understood the importance of valuing land correctly, and they weren't fighting that issue. Very seldom would I find anyone who said, well, that land is assessed, that we shouldn't be assessing land high. The assessors want to do their job correctly. And so I don't think I had quite the problem of being the only one who understood it. I think most of my colleagues understood it. The problem is they're not collecting enough of it. Collecting less than 1% when the annual rental is at least 6%. So you're only getting a small part of the land rent each year. That's why, we don't have the situation. We just don't collect enough to have the impact to change things for the better. We'll see things better once we collect more and more of the land rent. But until we reach that point, we really have to convince people to collect more land rent now than they are.
One advantage to if the assessments of land values alone were made publicly available, and people could then check their assessment against their neighbor, etc. Do you think that would make most people more supportive of taxing more of the land value and less of the improvement value? And are such assessments easily available to the public?
Well, in most states, land assessments are public information, and building assessments are public information.
Also,
the problem we have in most states is that they don't revalue annually. Some of them wait and do it every 5 years, or some every 10 years, and some don't get around to doing it for 30 years. And that's kind of like what happened in British Columbia when I went up there, is they had not revalued land in 30 years. So to come in, it totally changed everything overnight. And we need to do the same thing in states, that don't have the public information or that don't do a good job of reassessing. We need to encourage them to do the job correctly, or get the legislation that requires it. I think that for the most part, most assessors want the information to be public, unless they're in a situation where it's prohibited by law.
Okay. I think we've almost exhausted the questions. There's been some information has come in on resources where people can go. Mary Rose proposes looking at www.marketwatch.com /story/how to reduce the tax hit on soon to be developed land. And there's another website that Mary Rose cites, hgta.org, propositions/proposition-13, etc. So maybe Mary Rose can make this available to Sue, and maybe that can go out to people who've attended this. And I think we've exhausted almost all the questions. And so
I thank you all, and I promise that in 2 weeks I will have the pictures of the New York Library up. I was just handed them a minute ago, so I know I've got them available, and I'll present them 2 weeks from tonight.
And can you say just a word about that session 2 weeks from tonight?
It's a report from the various Georgist organizations.
Okay.
And there'll be the Henry George Institute will be one, the Foundation for Economic Justice will be another, the American Journal of Economics and Sociology will be another, and Common Ground will be one. So it's those four organizations that will be presenting activities that they're involved in and demonstrating what they're doing, what their active activities are.
Okay, if you're new to this work, or if you're a returning veteran or constantly tuning in, tune into this in 2 weeks. I presume it will be a similar webinar format, unless it will be
same codes that were tonight will be on next week and the following week. And next week we will have the Robert Schockenbach Foundation talking about their new think tank, the Center for Property Tax Reform, I believe is the name. And they'll Josie Foss, Brendan Hennigan, and Joshua Vinson will be talking to us on Sunday at 2 o'clock Eastern. Steve Sklar, a member of the Henry George Institute Board and of the Schockenbach Board, and who talked to us several weeks ago, is coming back about his profession of immigration. He's an immigration attorney. He's quite good. But so we do welcome you to come on and to write me if you want to make sure you have the codes. Just sns@swwalton.com will get to me, or sue@swwalton. If you only put one W, you will get in Walmart, and I don't think you all want to go to Walmart.
okay. Well, one last question came in, or are we out of time?
You can have one more question, and then we can.
All right, this is an interesting one. It is from Yanni. Recently, Robert Shiller, who's one of the Nobel economists, described Henry George as a, quote, sensationalist phenomenon, unquote, whose message caught like wildfire. Viral, we would say today. But it faded fast and now is part of marginal history. Your response to Robert Shiller?
Well, Schilling produces this wonderful study of land value city by city across the United States. And I've followed him for years. I mean, he's been doing this, many years now. And you're able to project land value increases very well by using his stats. And so I'm kind of a fan of his. Whatever he says, I still look at the work he's done, and I think he's doing some remarkable statistical work.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you to everyone who submitted comments and questions.
Nicholas Rosen, president of the Henry George Institute, said he will post a summary of this talk on his web blog, and which is good. Nicholas is a prolific writer.
Say once again that this was made possible with support mostly from the Robert Schockenbach Foundation, but also from the Foundation for Economic Justice, Common Ground USA, Henry George Institute, Earth Sharing Associates, and personal donations from Gib Halberson, Sue Hansel, Mark Sullivan, and Osama Uhera.